Mark the Evangelist. He's the guy who wrote the Gospel of Mark, right? Right? There's a school of critical academic thought, that says all of the Gospels are actually anonymous. The historical evidence is somewhat thin, certainly contradictory, but everything in the first century is a bit like that, and indeed the second, and a little bit beyond. So tradition has it that the Gospel of Mark was written by Mark. Now, Mark balances precariously within the synoptic Gospels, with one hand supported by Matthew's much longer and prophecy-inspired Gospel, which tradition says is the first Gospel, the other hand supported by Luke's Gentile-friendly Gospel, and a final hand supporting Mark's own vastly shorter and, dare I say, less fussy Gospel. The Gospel of Mark, there's broad agreement, was actually the first Gospel. More on that later. We're not going to talk about John's non-synoptic Gospel. In the Acts of the Apostles, there's John Mark. Mark is identified as the cousin of Barnabas. There's a tradition, I think the tradition that says that all of these are Mark the Apostle. There's people who argue the opposite, but after escaping imprisonment from the Romans, Peter flees to Mary's house, and there he discovers Mary's son Mark. And in due course, Peter dictates his experience to Mark. And that's what Mark's Gospel is. It's supposed to be Peter's story of the Gospel. Mark moves in elevated circles. He goes with Paul and Barnabas to Cyprus after their mission in Jerusalem. But in Perga, Mark leaves them. And it's never explained why exactly. But whatever the reason, it really drives Paul round the bend. He later breaks with Barnabas when Barnabas suggests that Mark comes with him again. There's some evidence in Timothy that they make up later on. It's actually a little bit equivocal. Who's speaking in Timothy? Tradition also has it that the Last Supper took place at Mark's parents' house. And there's one further weird detail, the so-called naked fugitive. In Mark's Gospel, and Mark's Gospel alone, a young boy wearing only a linen blanket runs after Jesus as he's being arrested. The guards grab him, he struggles and escapes, and the guards are left holding the blanket, but the boy runs away naked. A slapstick moment at the arrest of Jesus. The suggestion is that in a sort of Hitchcockian way, Mark is telling his story, a moment in his life where he was close to Jesus at a critical time. He's putting himself in the story. There are lots of other theories. You might think that this amazing moment would be caught on camera a lot, that the artist of history would record Mark's escape, the naked fugitive, in the pictures of the arrest of Jesus, but that's not what happens so much. And I think that's probably because there's such a melee. There's Peter cutting off the ear of a guard, Christ immediately healing it according to some of the Gospels. It's a bit of a mess. And there's no room to really clearly denote Mark escaping, or whoever it is who is escaping naked. The Coptic tradition gives us a little bit more, and that's because Mark is the founding bishop of the Alexandrian church, which is what the Coptic church is. The Coptic church, for instance, says that the wedding at Cana, where the first miracle happens, actually happens at Mark's parents' house. It's Mark's family, and Mark is a cupbearer. It kind of makes you wonder, though, if that's the case, why didn't Mark include it in his gospel? Perhaps he had an inside track on the first miracle, and that somewhat pulled back the curtain for Mark. So you want a dozen red and one white for the ladies? What are today's prices? Thank you, Jesus. The Coptic tradition also tells us how St. Mark, with his father, comes across two lions. Mark's father tells his son to run, but Mark calls for Christ's help. Oh, Jesus, please help. And the lions drop down dead. What have you done? Mark annoys the people of Alexandria. They put a rope around his neck. They drag him round the streets of Alexandria, and not in a nice way, until he's dead. Until he was martyred. When they tried to burn him, there was a deluge that washed them all off the streets. Right. But this is not the end. 900 or so years later, the Venetians take it into their heads to steal his body, which, with a bit of St. Claudia body swapping, they achieve. Although the Coptic Church believes his head remains in Alexandria. The remains of Mark now lie in St. Mark's Basilica in Venice. St. Mark continues to perform miracles post-mortem, and Tintoretto tries to capture them all, whether it's saving a Saracen at sea or destroying the torture instruments before they can be used on a slave. You have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. So why is there a consensus that Mark probably is the first gospel? Well, there's a kind of obviousness to it. If you take the sections with just tiny changes in word order that are common to Mark, Matthew and Luke, the so-called triple tradition, right there you've got nearly all of Mark, 76%. If you add in the bits that are only in Mark and Matthew, or only in Mark and Luke, you're left with just 3% of material that's unique to Mark. While it's easy to imagine Matthew and Luke picking and changing from Mark as the source, it's harder to see why Mark would have bothered if he was using Luke and Matthew. The similar wording makes it obvious that there was a common sourcing here. The bits that are unique to Mark are telling. For example, they concern miracles where Jesus uses spit to cure blindness in one case, mutism in another. You can see that might be a bit wizardy rather than messiah-y for Matthew and Luke. In other triple tradition cases, Mark uses two phrases about the same incident, while Matthew and Luke simply pick one. It would be much harder for Mark to achieve, possible but harder, and there are quite a few of these. And Mark is harder in other ways. There are a few readings where Jesus or the disciples come off just a tiny bit less glowing. My guess is that Mark does have a broadly single author, that it is probably signed by someone called Mark. It's just a minimal hypothesis, but it's completely plausible that better evidence will show that's not the case. Most of the Gospels are a little bit like that. Mark's is the best because it's easily the shortest, the fast Gospel. There's only one joke in it that's actually funny.